Hi, this is Pat Fiorello, and I'm coming to you today to talk a little bit about watercolor supplies. This video is intended for my students who are taking the Introduction to Watercolor class, so they're brand new and haven't painted at all before. So I wanted to give a little bit of an overview about the tools that we need, the supplies that we use while we're watercolor painting, because those supplies are a very important part of the process, and understanding your tools will help you be more effective in using them. So what are the materials that we need for watercolor? Well, first of all, because watercolor is a paint that we're using with water, we need a particular type of paper that we're going to be painting on. So specifically, we use watercolor paper. And there are a number of ways that you can buy watercolor paper. The first way is you can buy what's called a full sheet. There is a standard in the industry that 22 inches by 30 inches is the standard size for what's called a full sheet of watercolor. So you can buy them loose individually. You can also fold these in half and quarter, any size, and rip them into smaller pieces if you want to do a painting that's smaller than this. And of course, as you're a beginner, you'll be working smaller than this. If you do choose to buy these individual sheets, what I do is I have a plexiglass that I got at the Home Depot. I had them cut it for the size of, say, a half sheet, and I just tape my paper to that. I just tape my paper to that plexiglass so that the plexiglass is not absorbent like wood or some other cardboard or anything else would be. The plexiglass doesn't absorb the water from the paper as I'm painting along and cause any issues that way. But that's only one way that you could buy paper for watercolor. You could also buy individual pads, and these are great for learning, for beginning students. You can rip a page out and just paint with it that way. You also find spiral bound pads that are good for beginners, but I like these individual so that you can rip a page out and paint one piece at a time. If you tend to paint in these, it's possible that the next page behind it could get wet. So that's why I don't really favor the spiral bound as much as these individual pads where you can take a piece of paper out and then put it on a board like that. My favorite way to use paper is on what's called a block, and these Arches blocks are wonderful, but many brands offer these blocks. And what a block of paper is basically 20 sheets of watercolor paper mounted to a hard board. So there's glue all around except for a little notch here. And this holds the paper taut. Now, why is that important? Well, if you think about putting water on a newspaper or a piece of photocopy paper, the paper gets all crinkly, and that's not good for watercolor. So we're using already a special paper designed for watercolor, but still, if you're using a lot of water, it's possible for the paper to wrinkle and warp. So, you know, in the old days, I don't know if people still do this, but they would take that big sheet of the watercolor paper, soak it in put it in a bathtub, soak it, stretch it taut, and staple it down or tape it down to a board so that it would hold taut. It wouldn't expand and contract as you add water to it. By gluing this all around in this block, it performs a similar role, that the paper is taut and you're not going to get that bubbling up and down as you're using water. If you use a lot of water, it still can happen, but this really helps with that. The other thing that's great about this, it's handy to take with you to travel, or if you want to paint outside, you can just throw it in your backpack and just put it right on your lap, because it's got this hard board underneath, and then you just paint on a piece of paper. You don't have to worry about paint going through to the next piece of paper. It'll just stay on the surface, and when then this painting dries, you just go in with a little knife and at this notch where it's not glued, start to peel this and then peel one sheet off, and there's 19 more sheets of paper for you there. So that's a convenient way to get the paper, and you can get them in all different sizes, from a small little postcard size, 12 by 16, 7 by 10, This one is 14 by 20, and they have some even bigger. So these I really like. In terms of the brands, I really do like the Arches paper. It's a very popular brand. It may cost a little bit more, but it's worth it. The way that the paint stays on the paper, the ability to lift off some of the paint when you need to, this paper is really durable for that, and it's a really fine quality paper. Now, what else do you need to know about paper? Well, if you go to the store, there'll be many different options. So first of all, there's different options in terms of the surface. You can get what's called a rough surface that will have texture to it. You can have a hot press surface where they actually roll the paper through another press and smooth out all the ups and downs so that it's really slick. I find for beginning students sometimes it's a little harder to work on that because it's a little bit more slippery. So between the rough and the hot press, in the middle is something called cold press. And I think that's one of the most popular textures of paper that people use. I use that almost exclusively. I don't know if you can see very much on here, but the hot press is very slick. There's no surface texture to it. The rough has a texture to it, if you can see some of that, and the cold press is in between. So those are your options. Again, if you're just starting out, I really would recommend going with the cold press. I mean, it's pretty much the middle of these two extremes. Now, in addition to textures, you also have choices of weights. And what do the weights of the paper mean? There's 90 pound, there's 140 pound, there's 300 pound. So how they come up with that is, say, 300 pound paper. Remember that big sheet I had in the beginning, the standard 22 by 30 sheet? Well, if you took a ream of that, which 500 sheets, and put it on a scale, it would be 300 pounds. That's where they come up with that nomenclature. And it's really not important to know that. The thing to remember, though, is the higher the number, the thicker the paper, and it'll be also more expensive. I have some examples here of, 90 pound paper, which you see it's slightly heavier than your photocopy paper, but it's certainly something that you could do watercolor on. But it's pretty lightweight, and the more water that you use, the more likely this one is to warp because it's thin. The heaviest paper that people typically use is a 300 pound paper. You can see this is a lot stiffer than, say, the 90 pound paper is. So it will be a lot less likely to warp when there's water on it, but it's also quite a bit more expensive. So when you're first learning, I don't think you really need to go all the way up to 300 pound. As you continue to paint and explore, certainly try out these other textures and weights to see if you like them. But, I think a great weight starting out is just your 140 pound. It's not so thin as the 90 pound, but it's not so expensive as a 300 pound. So the bottom line is, I would recommend 140 pound cold press paper. If you can get Arches in a block, that's ideal. That's what I would highly recommend. So that's really what you need to know about paper. And then let's talk about palettes. Really, for watercolor, anything that is basically a white non-porous surface can be used as a palette. In my beginning classes, sometimes we just start out with a white foam dish, paper dish, but it's the foam, so it's not absorbing the water into it. You could use a white china dish. There's all sorts of smaller palettes, which are fine to use as you're starting out, and they're not very expensive. This is nice because it's got a mixing area. And one thing that's really important is you want to be able to have an area to mix your paints. There are some small palettes that just have places to put the paint, but then no place to mix. So that really doesn't get you what you need. But something like this is fine to start out with. As you go on and you say, well, you know what, I really am liking watercolor. I think I want to do this on more of a regular basis, you can upgrade to a palette like this. And they're usually $25, $30. But what's nice about this is it's got a cover that comes off, and it's got plenty of wells here to put out your colors, and then plenty of mixing room as well. And then at the end of the day, when you're done, you just put on the cover and store this and come back in another week, a few days, a month. You can leave your paints in here and they'll be ready to use next time. You don't have to throw out any paint, which is wonderful about watercolor. Before I paint the next time, I'll just take out my squirt bottle, squirt the paints, and it refreshes them and they're ready to go again. So the palettes are pretty easy. Again, these types of palettes, they're pretty lightweight. I've taken them on airplanes with me. I've taken them all over the world. They're, you know, pretty easy to transport, and having the lid on them really makes it economical as far as saving your paints after you're finished painting for the day. The next thing I want to talk about are water cups. And you could use anything for water cups. I mean, I've been in hotel rooms where I use the paper cups. These are, you know, from food containers, Tupperware. You could use yogurt cups, whatever cups you might have around the house. There's nothing special that you need. And I recommend having two. One is for clean water, one's for dirty water. They can be both the same size. These just happen to be different sizes. And as you're painting, when you need clean water to mix up a puddle of paint, you'll go into the clean water cup and mix that water around with the paint. After you're done with that color, when you want to change to another color, you're going to swish the brush around in the dirty paint, tap all that excess off, and then put your brush into the clean water, pick up some clean water, and go into the next color. So that's how you use these two together. Inevitably, as you're painting, you will forget which is dirty and which is clean, and they'll both be dirty, so you just go get some fresh water. It's not a big deal. I do put them in this little Tupperware just to keep them a little from getting the tabletop and everything wet. But those are easy, and you probably have something right around your house you can use. I also do, for watercolor, I like to paint at a little, like a 45-degree angle on a tabletop. I typically don't paint on the easel with watercolor, except maybe when I'm outdoor painting, I might be doing that. When I paint in oils, I tend to be painting at the easel. But for watercolor, you can paint flat, but it is nice to have a little bit of an angle that you can prop up your paper. So basically, I'd be propping it up like this, and that little bit of an angle helps the paint flow down and stay clean and nothing running back up paper, like gravity is actually helping you. This is a little wooden block my dad made for me, but you know, I've been in classes many times where I just prop this up on a tissue box or a cup or anything that just gives me a little bit of an angle to paint at. So next, let's talk about paints. So paints, there are a couple of different types you can get. There are artist grade paints, which are the fine quality paints, and there are student grade paints. The pigments in there are the same, just there's kind of a filler, extra filler in the student grade, which allows them to sell it for less money. So if you're just starting out and you're on a budget, you can start out with the student grade paints. It's fine to work with those. You'll find over time, if you continue with this though, you will want to upgrade to the artist grade. You're going to have a finer color. Sometimes the additives that they have in the student grade paint might have a bit of white or chalkiness in them, so the colors tend to be a little bit duller. But for starting out learning, you know, that's perfectly fine. The paints also come in a couple of different forms. You can get paints in that are in a pan like this. This was actually my very, very first painting kit, and it's good for taking on location with you. You can easily stick this in your purse or pocket. And these pigments are the same quality pigment that are in the paint tubes. They're just in a different form. The good thing about this, it's easy to carry around. Nothing's going to leak. You know, for travel purposes, it's great. I personally prefer the tube paints because they're already coming out of tube fluid and there's less of the kind of rubbing to get the pigment up and running. So if I have my choice, I like to go for the tubes. The very tiny tubes, you know, might look a little bit less expensive, you know, out of pocket. This one's like a half of an ounce. But the medium size actually probably are a better value over time. These sometimes I find tend to dry out. But these come in many, many colors. I do have a recommendation for some basic colors that you want to go with. A warm and cool of each of the primary colors. So maybe a lemon yellow and an Indian yellow, and you might even throw in a cadmium yellow too. Maybe a cadmium red and an alizarin, and maybe a cerulean blue and an ultramarine blue, and then burnt sienna, and if you've got room for a little more, maybe a viridian or a phthalo green. So, you know, there's just kind of a basic palette that you can start out with, and I'll list those colors in the comments on this video so you have the list. But then there's many other choices for colors you can expand into, but with those colors that I just mentioned, you really could paint almost anything. So in the beginning, it's tempting to see all these beautiful colors and want them all, but you're better off working with a limited palette when you're starting, just so you learn how to mix the colors and don't really get overwhelmed by so many choices. So that's what you need to know about the paints. There's a lot of different brands. There's no reason you can't mix and match the brands. There's nothing that you need to keep them apart. You might see some paints out there called gouache. They are different than watercolors. They're not as transparent. They're kind of watercolors, maybe with a little chalkiness in there. So they're a little bit more opaque. You can use them interchangeably with the watercolors, but just know they're going to have a different look and feel. Watercolor, the beauty of watercolor and what's unique about it compared to other mediums, the paints are mostly transparent. So you're seeing the light of the paper glow through the paint back to your eye when you see a watercolor. So that's what we need to know about the paints. This is something else that's kind of handy. And this is a paint ringer, and what you do is you put the tube of paint in here, and then you just roll it. So kind of like your toothpaste tube, you get every last ounce out of it. So this is a very worthwhile investment. I use this all the time to get the most out of my paint tubes. And those are available commonly at an art supply store or online. The last major topic that we have is brushes. You know, and if you go to an art supply store, there'll be rows and rows of brushes. How do you know what you need? And the brushes can be, you know, a few dollars up to hundreds of dollars. There are natural hairs, there's synthetics. And for starting out, you know, there's a lot of good quality synthetic brushes. You don't need to have an expensive natural sable hair brush. And what I would recommend to start out with, well, first let's see the types of brushes. There are round brushes, you know, that you know, typically going around, they'll, you know, be what you expect of a brush. And then there are flat brushes, which if you see the head of them, they kind of have what I call a, you know, it's like having a crew cut. There's just a flat line there. They're narrower that way. A round brush has like a fatter belly here and will hold more water. There's less hairs this way, so the flat brushes tend to hold a little bit less water. And you can make similar marks with these different brushes. Sometimes with the flat brush, though, if you're doing like architecture or something where you need a straight line or a fence post, it's easy because this edge is straight as opposed to trying to make a straight line with a round brush. If you only have a round brush, you could still make a straight line with it at the point. So those are the two major types of brushes. It's nice also to have a big wash brush, so when you're wetting your paper, if you start wetting the paper and then painting into wet into wet, you've got something big to cover the paper right away. It would be hard to cover a whole paper with this small brush. So this comes in handy for that. And then there are also a rigger brush. I don't have one handy right now. This might be close to it, where it's got longer, thinner hair, and you can make thin lines like wires or tree branches. It's really more for calligraphy type marks. You wouldn't do a whole painting with a rigger. But those are really the primary brushes that you need to know about. Now, you know, you can get this flat brush and you can get this flat brush and you can get even a bigger one. So they come in many different sizes. There are numbers on the brushes, but not every company abides by the same exact numbering system. So I don't even really pay attention to the numbers so much. I just think about the size of the brush compared to the size of the shape that I'm making. And I try to use as big a brush as I can to make that shape. The smaller the brush, you tend to, you don't want to be painting down like this. You want to come back and use your shoulder to be making your marks. So if you have a large area in a painting, if you can make the mark with a bigger brush, you're going to have fewer brush strokes to make that big shape, so the painting's going to tend to hang together more. So I definitely would recommend having a range of sizes, but again, when you're starting out, something like a half inch synthetic brush is really helpful, and maybe then a 3/4 inch would be fine on the flats. And then on the rounds, again, like a number 10 would be great. Try to avoid a lot of the tiny brushes. You'll see in some of the kits that you get that are pre-made with a few different brushes in them, they tend to have a lot of really tiny brushes. Again, those are for tiny details at the end of a painting. You really want to use as big a brush as you possibly can. And also you can get some of these nice holders for your brushes to keep them in good condition. One thing about washing the brushes, I just simply wash them out with water. I go into the sink and just rinse them out. In 25 years of painting, I've never used anything else on my watercolor brushes. I don't use soap or anything or any kind of brush cleaner. Just rinsing them out tends to be fine. When you dry them, try to leave them laying flat to dry, or they're actually brush hangers where you can hold them this way in a clip and they dry downwards. You don't really need that initially, but what you want to avoid is kind of leaving them in the cup with water. Sometimes I see students doing that. It's kind of a holdover, I think, from elementary school where we had all the brushes in the cups of water, but that can actually be damaging to your brush, where if too much water gets soaked in over time, they get waterlogged, the ferrule actually can swell and the hairs start coming out and you lose your brush. So just be mindful not to always leave the brushes soaking in water. I think that's it for the major components. There are a few other small, kind of nice to have items to think about having. Of course, you do need some paper towels. It is helpful to have some tissues. There are some techniques where you can actually use a tissue to lift out, say lifting out clouds and that sort of thing. You'll want a number 2 pencil to possibly draw a light sketch in on your paper. And I do like either these white plastic erasers or the kneaded erasers that you pull out and stretch and lift off. Avoid using the pink eraser that is on the side of your pencil, because that will actually leave pink marks on your paper and make like an abrasion on the paper, and then you can't get it off. So get a separate eraser to take care of anything you might want to lift off your paper. Sometimes I get an old toothbrush. You can splatter paint by putting the toothbrush hair in the paint, and then you just run your finger and you get splattering onto the paper, which gives kind of a nice energetic effect. So in the beginning class, we'll go over some of these techniques, but just want you to be aware of some other materials you might want to have on hand. Sometimes I like a natural hair sponge. The same thing, I can dip it into the paint and make marks on the paper, you know, maybe for trees and things like that. So it's nice to have a natural hair brush, a sponge, I mean, and not, you know, a kitchen type sponge, but a natural sponge, because it will have kind of varied type edges, which make a nice kind of texture for the paint. Cut up old credit card. There are a lot of different techniques you can use with a credit card to scratch out paint and make various grasses or stones and different things. So cut up an old credit card, and that can be a handy tool. You might want to have some masking tape. I mean, this can be from Ace Hardware. It doesn't need to be any special tape. I prefer to use this beige tape than the blue tape. When you're using blue tape, it distorts your color perception of what's going on in the painting, so the neutral color tape is better. But sometimes you'll need this either to tape down your paper to the board, like I was mentioning in the beginning, or to tape over an area where you don't want any paint to go, like to preserve an area that you want to paint later. So that's handy to have. And then kosher salt. Sometimes can be fun. There are techniques where you put some of the salt into the paint, and it'll create sparkles and textures and things like that. And then, of course, some sort of spritzer bottle to, you can spritz your paints and make some effects like the salt as well, or just to spritz your paint to, you know, loosen them up and make them a little bit moist if they've been in the palette with the cover on for a while. So I think those are the major things that you need. Really, it sounds like a lot, but to get started, you really don't need a lot. You could use a white china plate for your palette. You can buy a small pad or block for your paper, 2 or 3 brushes, a water cup, and a limited selection of paints, and that's plenty to get you started. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it, and best wishes to you on your journey of exploring watercolor. I hope you have fun, and if I can be of any help to you, please feel free to reach out, and maybe I'll see you on one of our Zoom beginning painting classes. Thanks so much. Take care and have a great day. Bye.